My name is Olivia Perez, and I was 27 years old when my mother hosted the family dinner that finally made something inside me go quiet. It was a Sunday evening in early spring when I pulled into the driveway of my parents' house in the suburbs outside Austin, the same house I grew up in, the same beige siding and trimmed hedges that had always pretended nothing bad ever happened inside. I had not been invited to anything specific, just told to come by for dinner, so when I walked through the front door and saw the living room packed wall to wall with people folding chairs squeezed between borrowed tables' plates already set, voices loud and confident, I knew immediately I had misunderstood my role. There were more than 30 relatives there, aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends I barely recognized, all dressed like they were attending a church banquet, and when they turned to look at me, the room went briefly still in a way that did not feel welcoming. No one hugged me. No one said hello. A few people nodded like I was a delivery person who had wandered into the wrong house, then turned back to their conversations. I stood there holding my purse strap too tight, waiting for my mother to notice me to say my name to claim me. She did not. Instead, she laughed at something my younger brother Mateo said, her hand resting proudly on his shoulder, her voice warm in a way I had not heard directed at me in years. I moved toward the dining area and found the only empty chair pushed against the far wall near the hallway. Not part of any cluster, not close enough to any conversation to join without interrupting. I sat down slowly, my back straight, my hands folded in my lap, already feeling like I had taken someone else's seat. Plates of food passed by me without stopping. Someone reached across my place setting to grab a basket of rolls, brushing my arm without looking at my face. The talk around the table swelled and flowed over me, promotions, pregnancies, new trucks, college plans for sons, praise for Mateo and his bright future, while I became a gap in the noise present but unacknowledged. I told myself to breathe, to wait, to remember that this was family and family could be awkward. But then my mother stood up and tapped her glass, smiling wide, the kind of smile she saved for public moments, and began to talk about pride and sacrifice, and how not every child repaid what they were given. Her eyes landed on me and stayed there. She spoke about responsibility and gratitude, about daughters who made poor choices, about how hard it was to watch someone waste their potential, and people around the table nodded along, some curious, some uncomfortable, none of them stopping her. I felt the heat rise in my face, but I did not cry. I did not argue. I watched as she walked to the wall of framed family photos and lifted down the picture of me from my college graduation, then another from my childhood, and set them on the counter as if they were clutter that needed clearing. She said calmly and loudly that some people chose to remove themselves from the family and that it was time to stop pretending otherwise. My father stayed seated. He did not look at me. I thought of all the times he had told me to keep quiet, that it was easier that way. And I understood that this dinner was not about food or togetherness. It was a performance. It was a lesson. It was meant to show me where I stood. I pushed my chair back gently, the sound barely noticeable under the chatter that resumed once my mother sat down, and I walked out through the same front door I had entered, my heart pounding, but my mind strangely clear. As I drove away, the house shrinking in my rearview mirror, one thought settled in with a cold certainty. They believed I belonged nowhere. They were wrong, and they were about to learn that belonging should never cost a person their dignity, their safety, or their name. I stayed seated for the moment after everyone else had settled, staring at the empty space in front of me, as if a plate might appear if I waited long enough, because leaving immediately would have felt like confirming what they already believed. The chair I sat in was slightly lower than the others, one leg wobbling whenever I shifted my weight pressed against the wall where the paint showed old scuffs from years of people passing by without stopping. From where I was, I could see every face at the table, but none of them looked back. Conversation flowed around me in confident overlapping waves, stories about sons buying houses, sons getting promotions, sons starting families, each sentence landing like a reminder of the order I had never fit into. My brother Mateo sat near the center, relaxed, laughing loudly, his shoulders broad and comfortable in a way that came from always being supported. My mother kept touching his arm as he spoke, correcting small details with affection, nodding proudly when relatives praised him. No one asked me about my work, my life, or why I had come. When food finally reached my end of the table, it arrived picked over a spoonful of rice clinging to the edge of a serving dish, a piece of chicken already cut in half. I served myself quietly aware that every movement felt watched, even if no one was looking directly at me. A cousin leaned across my place, setting again reaching for a bowl, her elbow bumping my glass and sloshing water onto the tablecloth. She muttered, "Excuse me," without meeting my eyes, and turned back to her conversation before I could answer. I realized then that this was not accidental neglect. This was practiced. This was familiar. Growing up, I had learned to eat last, to speak softly, to step aside when my brother entered a room because my parents believed boys needed space and girls needed discipline. When Mateo broke something, it was a mistake. When I did, it was proof of carelessness. Sitting there now, the same rules applied, just dressed up as polite adulthood. My mother asked everyone to bow their heads for a short prayer, thanking God for family unity and blessings, and as voices murmured around the table, I kept my eyes open, staring at the knot in the wood of the table, feeling a strange calm spread through me. I understood with painful clarity that the empty chair was not a coincidence. It was a message. It said I could be present without being included, visible without being valued. When the prayer ended, laughter resumed immediately, and my father raised his glass to toast the family. His voice steady, his eyes skimming past me as if I were part of the furniture. He spoke about tradition and respect, about children honoring their parents, and each word landed heavy in my chest. I wanted to stand up and ask where respect had been when I was 12, and he told me to stop crying after my mother slapped me for talking back, or when he punched a hole in the hallway wall and told us all to keep quiet because neighbors did not need to know our business. Instead, I swallowed and stayed seated. The humiliation was not loud. It was slow and deliberate, like water rising inch by inch. I noticed relatives exchanging glances, some uneasy, some amused, none intervening. And I realized how easy it was for people to accept cruelty when it was framed as family order. My hands trembled slightly as I set my fork down, not from fear, but from the effort of staying composed. I told myself again that I did not belong at that table, not because I was less than them, but because I refused to become small enough to fit the space they assigned me. My mother, Isabella Perez, smiled the entire time I sat there, and it took me longer than it should have to understand that her smile was not meant for me. It was wide and practiced the kind she wore to church fundraisers and school meetings, lips stretched just enough to show warmth without revealing anything underneath. She moved easily through the room, touching shoulders, refilling glasses, laughing at jokes she had already heard, performing the role everyone expected from her, as if this dinner were an extension of her public life. To anyone watching from the outside, she looked generous and attentive, a woman proud of her family, a mother surrounded by people who admired her. To me, that smile was a warning. I had seen it before, usually right before something cruel was delivered calmly and without apology. When she glanced at me, her eyes slid past my face like they did not need to stop there, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that came from being measured and found wanting. Growing up, my mother had mastered the art of correction, wrapped in kindness, telling me to stand straighter, speak softer, smile more, because people were watching. When I failed to meet her expectations, she never raised her voice. She lowered it. She leaned in close enough that only I could hear and reminded me that embarrassment was a choice, and I was choosing poorly. Watching her now, moving between relatives, praising my brother Mateo for his ambition, his discipline, his future, I could see how carefully she had built this moment. She introduced him to distant cousins like a prize, recounting his accomplishments with pride, framing his mistakes as lessons learned. When someone asked about me, she waved her hand lightly and said I was still figuring things out. Her tone indulgent, as if my life were a prolonged phase she tolerated out of obligation. Each time she said my name, it landed flat, stripped of affection, more label than identity. I remembered being a teenager and standing in the kitchen after she had slapped me for questioning her, her face, calm, her voice, even as she told me not to look so dramatic because people would think badly of us. That same composure filled the room now. It was not anger that drove her. It was control. The smile never faltered, even when the conversation turned toward sacrifice and disappointment, even when she began speaking in broad statements about daughters who took more than they gave, about how hard it was for parents to watch a child make choices that reflected poorly on the family. She did not say my name then, but she did not have to. Her gaze found me again, steady and unblinking, and I felt the room tilt, as if everyone could suddenly see what she saw. My father, Carlos, sat beside her, nodding occasionally, his expression distant, detached, in the way it always was when my mother spoke. He had learned long ago that silence was safer. I learned it too, but I had learned something else as well, that silence could also be a shield. As my mother spoke, I noticed how some relatives shifted in their seats, how a few avoided looking at me, how others watched with interest, waiting to see what would happen next. No one interrupted her. No one questioned her framing. The smile gave her permission. It told everyone that this was acceptable, that this was care delivered firmly, that this was family business handled responsibly. I felt a strange clarity settle over me, then a quiet understanding that the cruelty was not an accident or a lapse in judgment. It was deliberate. It was staged. The dinner, the crowd, the performance, all of it existed to reinforce a story she had been telling for years, that I was the problem, the difficult one, the child who did not fit the narrative she wanted to present to the world. Her smile was the sharpest part of it because it denied me the dignity of anger. It told everyone that whatever pain I felt was my own fault for not playing along. Sitting there watching her beam at the table she controlled so completely, I realized that the smile was not hiding anything. It was the point. My mother waited until the plates were mostly cleared and the noise settled into a comfortable hum before she stood up because she understood timing the way some people understood music. She lifted her glass lightly and tapped it once with a spoon, not hard enough to startle anyone, just enough to draw attention, and the room obeyed her immediately. Conversations faded. Chairs stilled, all eyes turned toward her with the expectation of something pleasant. She thanked everyone for coming, for making time, for being such a close and supportive family, her voice warm and steady, practiced by years of speaking in front of groups. Then she shifted subtly at first, her words drifting from gratitude to effort, from effort to sacrifice. She talked about how much parents give, how much they invest, how raising children requires patience and discipline, especially when some children resist guidance. I felt my spine straighten as if bracing for impact. She never raised her voice. She never used harsh language. That was what made it worse. She spoke about disappointment the way someone might talk about the weather unavoidable and inconvenient. She said some children repaid their parents with respect and hard work, while others took and took, convinced they were entitled to independence without responsibility. A few relatives nodded, murmuring agreement because the words were vague enough to sound reasonable and pointed enough to land where she intended. Then she looked directly at me, her smile softening, her head tilting slightly as if in sympathy. She said it broke her heart to watch a daughter drift away from family values, to see someone refuse help and then blame others for the consequences. She said it was painful to love a child who insisted on learning everything the hard way. The room was silent, except for the clink of ice in glasses. I could feel every pair of eyes move toward me, assessing, judging, waiting for a reaction. My hands rested flat on the table, my nails pressing into the wood, but my face remained still. I did not interrupt her. I did not defend myself. She continued, encouraged by the lack of resistance, explaining that boundaries were necessary, that sometimes tough love meant telling the truth in front of witnesses so there could be no confusion later. She said families fell apart when parents enabled bad behavior, and she would not be that kind of mother. She would not pretend anymore. That was when she turned and walked to the wall of family photos, the ones arranged carefully to tell a story of success and unity. She lifted down my picture first, then another, holding them up briefly as if to confirm her point. She said some people chose paths that led them away from the family, and it was time to stop pretending those choices did not have consequences. She placed the frames on the counter face down, the sound of glass touching granite sharp in the quiet room. I heard someone inhale sharply. I did not look around to see who. My father remained seated, his eyes fixed on his plate, his jaw tight. No one told her to stop. No one asked if this was necessary. The humiliation settled over me slowly, not like a slap, but like a weight heavy and undeniable. I was being corrected in public, reduced to an example my entire life summarized into a cautionary tale delivered by the person who had always controlled the narrative. I remembered being a child and standing in the living room while my parents argued, my mother insisting she was only trying to help, my father telling me to apologize even when I did not understand what I had done wrong. That same dynamic played out now, only larger, louder, and sanctioned by an audience. My mother finished by raising her glass again, proposing a toast to family, to honesty, to moving forward without denial. Glasses lifted around the table. Some people avoided my eyes. Others looked directly at me, curiosity flickering across their faces. I did not raise my glass. I sat there breathing evenly, my heart pounding, but my mind strangely detached, as if I were watching someone else endure this moment. In that silence, I understood the true purpose of the dinner. It was not to shame me into compliance. It was to rewrite the story publicly so that whatever came next would look justified. She was not just humiliating me. She was erasing me with witnesses, and she expected me to accept it quietly. My father, Carlos Perez, did not say a single word while my mother spoke, and his silence carried more weight than any insult she delivered. He sat at the table with his shoulders slightly hunched, hands folded near his plate, eyes fixed on the place where the wood grain darkened from years of wear, as if that small patch of table deserved more attention than his daughter. I watched him from the corner of my vision, waiting for some sign that he would intervene, that he would clear his throat, or shift his chair, or do anything that acknowledged what was happening. He did none of it. He had perfected the art of absence while physically present, a skill he had practiced my entire life. When I was a child and my mother corrected me too harshly, he would look away and tell me later that she meant well. When voices rose behind closed doors and objects slammed into walls, he would tell me to go to my room and keep quiet because neighbors did not need to hear our problems. That night at the table, he used the same strategy, shrinking inward, letting my mother take the lead, trusting that silence would protect him from blame. I remembered being 12 years old, standing in the hallway while my parents argued in the kitchen, my mother accusing me of disrespect, my father pacing back and forth, his temper tightening the air. When he finally lost control and struck the wall hard enough to crack the drywall, the sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. Afterward, he told us all to calm down, to stop making things dramatic, and my mother nodded, smoothing her hair, already rewriting the moment into something smaller. No one apologized. No one acknowledged the fear. We learned quickly that discomfort was something to be swallowed. Watching him now unmoving in his chair, I felt that old lesson press against my ribs. His silence was not confusion or shock. It was agreement. It was the quiet permission that had allowed my mother to dominate every space she entered. Around the table, relatives glanced at him occasionally, perhaps expecting him to say something to balance her words with a gentler perspective. When he did not, they took his stillness as confirmation. If the father did not object, then the mother must be right. That was how it had always worked in our family. Authority flowed downward and never apologized. I caught my brother Mateo looking between our parents with a faint smile, secure in the knowledge that whatever storm was happening did not concern him. He had never been on the receiving end of these performances. He had never been positioned as the problem. When he disappointed them, it was treated as stress or pressure. When I did, it became a moral failing. My father finally lifted his glass when my mother finished speaking, offering a brief toast to family unity, his voice low and controlled. He did not look at me when he spoke. The sound of glass touching glass rang out around the table, sealing the moment in a way that felt official. I realized then that waiting for him to defend me was a habit I needed to break. He had chosen his role long ago, and it was not to protect. It was to preserve the image of order at any cost. The cost had always been me. As the dinner continued, conversation slowly resumed. Cautious at first, then louder, as if people were relieved to move past the discomfort. Laughter returned in bursts that felt forced, then genuine, and my mother settled back into her seat, satisfied. My father leaned toward her, murmuring something I could not hear, and she nodded, her hand resting on his arm. The scene closed around them like a curtain, and I was left sitting at the edge watching a family close ranks without me. The realization was sharp and clarifying. My mother had delivered the message, but my father had allowed it. His inaction was not neutrality. It was participation. And in that moment, as the noise rose and the plates clattered and the night carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened, I understood that the violence in our family had never been only physical. It had lived just as powerfully in the spaces where someone should have spoken and chose not to. The moment my mother walked to the wall of photographs was the moment I knew this dinner had crossed from humiliation into erasure. The frames hung there in a careful order, milestones arranged like proof of a successful life. Weddings, baptisms, graduations, holidays, all curated to tell a single story about who we were as a family. I had grown up under those images, absorbing the message that belonging was conditional and could be revised at any time. My mother stood in front of them with her back straight and her smile intact, explaining to the room that sometimes families had to accept hard truths that pretending only delayed healing. She reached for my college graduation photo, first fingers gripping the frame with deliberate calm, and lifted it off the wall. I felt a tight pressure in my chest, not surprise but recognition, because I had seen her do this before on a smaller scale, removing me from conversations, from decisions, from affection, whenever I failed to align with her expectations. She set the frame on the counter, face down, the soft thud of wood against stone, sounding louder than it should have. Then she reached for another picture, one of me as a child, standing between my parents, my smile wide and unguarded in a way I barely remembered, and took that one down too. Someone near the table shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. My mother said evenly that there was no point displaying images that no longer represented reality, that honesty required consistency. She said that when a person chose independence over family, they also chose distance, and it was unfair to pretend otherwise. Her words were smooth and reasonable, crafted to sound like wisdom instead of punishment. I looked at my father, then willing him to meet my eyes to acknowledge that this was wrong, but he stared straight ahead, his jaw set, his silence heavy. The room felt suspended, as if everyone were holding their breath, waiting to see how far she would go. She turned back to the wall and paused, her hand hovering near the remaining frames, as if considering whether to take more down. The pause was intentional. It gave the moment weight. It let the message sink in. I realized then that this was not about correcting my behavior or teaching me a lesson. It was about control. By removing my image in front of witnesses, she was rewriting the family record in real time, establishing a new truth that others would accept because it had been presented so confidently. I thought of all the times she had told me that family was everything, that loyalty mattered more than feelings, that airing problems was a betrayal. Now she was doing the opposite, but only because she held the power to frame it as necessary. My brother Matteo watched quietly, his expression unreadable, his position secure enough that he did not need to intervene. My sister Sophia avoided looking at me altogether, her shoulders tense, caught between sympathy and self-preservation. I felt strangely calm as I watched my own life being edited out, because something fundamental had shifted. The fear that had kept me compliant for years loosened its grip. I understood with absolute clarity that if I stayed seated, if I accepted this quietly, it would become permanent. This would be the story repeated at future gatherings, the justification for whatever came next. My mother finished by turning back to the table and saying matter-of-factly that sometimes parents had to let go for the good of the whole, that not everyone could be included forever. She smiled again, as if expecting understanding, as if what she had just done was an act of courage. A few relatives nodded, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge her. Others looked at their plates. No one spoke my name. In that silence, I felt myself disappear from the room, not physically, but socially, as if a line had been drawn, and I was now standing on the wrong side of it. I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping softly against the floor, and stood up. The sound cut through the murmur that had begun to rise again, drawing a few glances my way. My mother did not turn. My father did not look up. I picked up my purse and walked toward the front door, each step steady, my heart pounding, but my resolve firm. No one tried to stop me. No one asked where I was going. As I opened the door and felt the cool evening air on my face, I knew that whatever pain I carried out with me was lighter than the weight I would have borne if I had stayed. They had erased me publicly, believing that would diminish me. What they did not understand was that by doing so, they had finally shown me the truth without disguise. And once you see the truth that clearly you cannot unsee it, and you do not owe anyone the performance of pretending otherwise. I did not rush when I left the house because rushing would have looked like defeat, and I refused to give them that satisfaction. I walked down the front steps slowly, my shoes clicking softly against the concrete, aware of how quiet everything felt once the door closed behind me. The sounds of laughter and clinking glasses faded almost immediately, replaced by the hum of the neighborhood and the distant bark of a dog somewhere down the block. The porch light cast a yellow glow over the driveway where I had parked, and for a brief moment I stood there breathing an air that felt cleaner, simply because it was not shared. I slid into my car and closed the door, my hands shaking slightly as I rested them on the steering wheel, not from fear, but from the sudden release of tension I had been holding in my body for years. I sat there longer than necessary, staring at the familiar outline of the house. The windows lit warmly, the silhouette of people moving inside as if nothing had happened. That image burned itself into my mind because it confirmed what I had always sensed but never fully accepted. They would continue without me, and they believed that was proof of their strength. As I backed out of the driveway and turned onto the street, I thought about every time I had been told to be patient, to be understanding, to keep the peace, and how those words had always translated into silence on my part. Driving away felt different. It felt intentional. I did not cry. I did not scream. I let the quiet settle around me as the streets blurred past familiar landmarks, slipping by the grocery store where my mother used to remind me to behave, the park where my father once told me to stop being sensitive when I flinched at his raised voice. Each memory lined up neatly, forming a pattern that finally made sense. By the time I reached the main road, my phone buzzed once in my purse, then again, but I did not reach for it. I already knew who it would be. Someone checking whether I had learned my lesson, whether I would come back apologetic and smaller. I kept driving. The realization that settled over me then was sharp and steady, not dramatic, but decisive. This was not the end of something. It was the end of pretending. They thought I had walked out empty-handed, stripped of my place in the family, humbled by their judgment. What they did not know was that I had been paying attention for a long time. I had noticed the mail that never reached me, the accounts I did not recognize, the way my mother insisted on handling things that should have been mine to manage. I had ignored those signs because believing my family meant safety was easier than questioning them. That dinner took that comfort away, but it gave me something more useful in return. It gave me certainty. As I drove through the quiet streets toward my apartment, the city lights growing brighter ahead, I understood that belonging should never require surrendering your dignity, your voice, or your name. They had tried to erase me in front of witnesses, assuming that isolation would break me. Instead, it clarified my next move. I did not know yet exactly how I would respond or how far this would go, but I knew one thing with absolute confidence. I would not go back to that table, and I would not carry their secrets for them anymore. The pattern I had ignored did not announce itself all at once, and that was the most dangerous part of it because it arrived disguised as normal family behavior, layered slowly over years until it felt ordinary. Sitting alone in my apartment later that night, the quiet humming of the refrigerator filling the space, I replayed small moments I had brushed aside because naming them would have required action. When I was 19 and starting my first year of college, my mother insisted we open a joint bank account so she could help me manage expenses. Her words gentle and reassuring, reminding me how complicated adult finances were. She framed it as love as protection as something good mothers did for daughters who were not yet ready. I signed the papers without reading them closely, trusting that her confidence meant competence. She set up the online access on my laptop herself, saved the passwords, and told me not to change them because she would handle anything confusing. At the time, it felt like relief. Over the years, she continued to insert herself into every financial detail of my life, insisting my mail should be sent to her house because it was safer telling me she would let me know if anything important arrived. When I asked questions, she laughed softly and said I worried too much, that she had raised a family and managed a household long before I knew what a credit score was. My father supported this arrangement without discussion, repeating that she was better with money, that I should be grateful. I learned to step back to let her take control because pushing against it always led to conflict that ended with me being told I was ungrateful. Looking back, I could see how consistently my independence had been delayed, how often decisions that should have been mine were rerouted through her authority. When I moved into my own place and began working full-time, nothing changed. She still reminded me to forward important documents, still asked casually about my income, still spoke as if my financial life were an extension of hers. At family gatherings, she joked about how I would be lost without her, and everyone laughed, reinforcing the idea that dependence was normal and expected. I absorbed that message quietly, telling myself that close families worked this way, that my discomfort was simply part of growing up. Even when I noticed odd things a bill, I did not remember receiving a notification that did not align with my spending. I dismissed them as mistakes or my own oversight. Questioning my mother felt like a betrayal, and I had been trained to avoid that at all costs. That night, however, the humiliation of the dinner stripped away my excuses. With the emotional noise gone, the facts lined up with unsettling clarity. Control had always been justified as care. Silence had been framed as respect. My role had been to trust and comply, not to verify. The realization was not explosive. It was quiet and precise, like, finally, seeing the outline of something that had been blocking the light all along. I understood then that the dinner was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was the culmination of a long-established pattern, one that relied on my cooperation to function. By stepping out of the house and refusing to play my assigned part, I had disrupted something fragile. The sense of calm I felt was not relief. It was resolve. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that what I had experienced was not normal family dynamics, but a system built on control, one that had cost me more than I had ever admitted. Financial control had always been presented to me as love, and that framing was powerful enough to override my instincts for years because it came wrapped in concern and authority. My mother never demanded control outright. She offered it as a favor, something she insisted would make my life easier, safer, more respectable. Whenever money came up, she reminded me how unpredictable the world was, how quickly things could fall apart if you did not have someone experienced watching over you. She liked to say she worried because she cared, and I absorbed that message until I could no longer tell where her concern ended and my compliance began. If I questioned a charge or asked why a statement had not arrived, she brushed it off with a soft laugh and told me not to stress over details, that details were her job. When I tried to take more responsibility, she warned me I was being impulsive, that I did not understand long-term consequences the way she did. Those conversations always ended the same way, with me feeling foolish for asking and relieved to hand things back to her. Over time, her involvement expanded quietly. She asked for updates on my income, my hours, my plans, not out of curiosity, but out of habit, as if that information belonged to her by default. If I hesitated, she accused me of hiding things, of pulling away, of becoming secretive. My father reinforced her authority, telling me she was just trying to help, that arguing about money was unnecessary and disrespectful. In our household, questioning control was treated as a character flaw. I learned to accept guidance without verification, to confuse obedience with maturity. Even when small inconsistencies surfaced, they were easy to dismiss because the cost of confrontation felt too high. A late notice that appeared out of nowhere could be blamed on mail delays. A balance that looked unfamiliar could be chalked up to my own forgetfulness. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own, and together they formed a cushion that protected her from scrutiny. At family gatherings, my mother enjoyed telling stories about how she kept everything running, how children these days did not understand responsibility, how lucky I was to have someone willing to step in. People laughed and nodded, reinforcing the narrative that her control was a virtue. I smiled along because pushing back would have required me to contradict her publicly, and I had been taught that doing so was unacceptable. That dynamic had a cost. By allowing her to manage my finances, I had surrendered not just access, but awareness. I did not know exactly what accounts were open in my name or where statements were sent. I trusted that anything important would be shared with me because that was what love was supposed to do. The dinner shattered that assumption. Sitting alone afterward, I replayed her words in my head and noticed how often they relied on fear, how often help was paired with reminders of what could go wrong if I did not listen. Love, I realized, does not require ignorance. Care does not demand silence. What she offered was not protection, it was dependence. The more I thought about it, the clearer the pattern became. Control was normalized. Boundaries were treated as rejection. Independence was framed as betrayal. That framework had kept me compliant long enough for her to operate without challenge. The recognition was unsettling because it forced me to confront my own role in maintaining the system. I had wanted to believe that my family meant safety, that trust was the right choice, because questioning them would have required me to accept a much harder truth. That night, stripped of the illusion of belonging, I could finally see the arrangement for what it was. Financial control had been the lever my mother used to keep me within reach, and I had mistaken the pressure for support. The clarity that followed was not comforting, but it was honest. If I wanted my life to be my own, I would have to take responsibility not just for my future, but for uncovering what had already been done in my name. The first warning arrived quietly, the way serious problems often do, without drama or urgency easy to dismiss if you were not looking closely. It came as a notification on my phone while I was at work, a small alert from a credit monitoring app I had downloaded months earlier and rarely checked. My score had dipped not enough to trigger panic, just enough to register as unusual. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, trying to remember if I had missed a payment or carried a higher balance than usual, but nothing came to mind. I had one credit card paid on time every month, and my student loan payments were automatic. The number did not match my habits. I told myself it was probably a reporting delay or some harmless fluctuation, the kind of thing my mother had always said not to worry about. I took a screenshot thinking I would look into it later and went back to answering emails, letting the day swallow the concern the way it always did. Over the next few weeks, similar moments stacked up quietly. A piece of mail forwarded from my parents' house that looked like marketing but felt oddly formal. An email thanking me for my interest in a financial product I did not remember researching. Each time I hesitated, felt a brief flicker of unease, then pushed it aside. Work deadlines piled up. Life stayed busy. Questioning those signs would have meant questioning my mother, and I was still operating under the belief that doing so would create more harm than ignoring them. That belief had been trained into me over years of conflict avoidance. In our family, peace was maintained by not asking certain questions, by trusting authority, even when it felt uncomfortable. When I mentioned the credit score dip casually during a phone call, my mother laughed and said those apps exaggerated everything, that scores went up and down all the time, and that I should not obsess over numbers. Her dismissal felt familiar and reassuring, and I accepted it without pressing further. Looking back, that moment stands out sharply because it was the point where instinct brushed up against conditioning and lost. The signs were there, clear enough to act on, but acting would have required me to step out of my assigned role. It was easier to believe there was a harmless explanation than to imagine something deliberate and harmful. That is how control survives. It relies on trust and fatigue and the hope that discomfort will resolve itself if given enough time. The dinner changed that calculus entirely. The humiliation stripped away my motivation to preserve the illusion of harmony. With nothing left to protect, the warning signs took on a different weight. They were no longer inconveniences to be managed later. They were evidence waiting to be examined. The realization unsettled me because it suggested that whatever had been happening had not started recently. It had likely been going on for years, hidden behind my willingness to defer and my belief that family meant safety. The first warning had not been loud, but it had been clear. I simply had not been ready to hear it. That night, after the noise of the dinner had faded and the city outside my apartment settled into its usual rhythm, I finally did the one thing I had avoided for months. I opened my laptop and sat at the small kitchen table, the surface still cluttered with mail I had not sorted, the glow of the screen cutting through the dim light. My hands were steady as I typed, not because I felt calm, but because something in me had already decided there was no turning back. I pulled up the website that allowed you to request your full credit reports and filled in my information carefully, double-checking each field, aware that I was stepping into territory my mother had always guarded closely. While the system processed my request, I forced myself to sit still, to breathe evenly, to resist the urge to distract myself with anything else. Waiting had never been my strength, but this time I needed the pause. When the first report loaded, I scanned it quickly, expecting to confirm my own mistake and move on. Instead, I felt a cold sensation spread through my chest as unfamiliar entries appeared on the screen. There were accounts listed that I did not recognize, opened in years I remembered clearly tied to addresses I had not lived at since I moved out of my parents' house. I scrolled slowly, reading each line twice, my eyes catching on details that made my stomach tighten. Small personal loans, a retail credit line, a consolidation account I had never authorized. Each one carried my name, my social security number, and the address of my parents' home. I opened the second report, then the third, hoping for inconsistency, for an error that would explain everything away. Instead, the same pattern repeated itself with slight variations like different drafts of the same lie. Dates lined up with periods when I had been busiest, least attentive, most trusting. The realization settled in gradually heavy and undeniable. This was not a mistake. This was not identity theft by a stranger. This required access. As I sat there, the hum of the refrigerator loud in the silence memories began to rearrange themselves into something coherent. The mail that never reached me, the statements I was told not to worry about, the way my mother insisted on handling anything that involved paperwork. I felt a brief surge of anger, sharp and hot, but it burned off quickly, replaced by focus. Panic would only make me sloppy, and I could not afford that. I opened a blank document and typed a single sentence at the top in capital letters so I would not forget my purpose. This is not about feelings. This is about facts. Then I created a new folder on my desktop and began saving everything. Each report, each page, each screenshot. I labeled files carefully, including dates and sources, building a structure that felt solid in a way my family never had. I took out a notebook and wrote down account numbers by hand, circling any entry that listed my parents' address. My breathing slowed as the work absorbed me. With every piece of information I documented, the situation became clearer and less overwhelming. This was something that could be addressed not with arguments or pleas, but with evidence. I pulled up the official government website for reporting identity theft and read through the process step by step, resisting the urge to rush. The language was precise and unemotional, focused on verification and documentation, and it steadied me. When I began filling out the report, I answered each question carefully, describing how someone with authorized access to my personal information had opened accounts without my consent and redirected correspondence away from me. I did not name anyone yet. I did not speculate. I stuck to what I could prove. When the confirmation screen appeared, I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes briefly, feeling the weight of what I had just done settle into place. This was no longer something happening in the dark. It had a record now. It had a trail. After submitting the report, I placed fraud alerts with each credit bureau and initiated a freeze on my credit file, locking it down so no new accounts could be opened without additional verification. The process was methodical and strangely calming, each step a small act of reclaiming territory I had not realized I had lost. By the time I shut my laptop, the night was deep and quiet, but my mind was clear. The dinner had shown me where I stood in my family. This investigation showed me what they had done with that position. I did not know yet how far this would go or who else might be involved, but I understood something fundamental. Whatever happened next would be decided by documentation, not denial. And for the first time in my life, that felt like an advantage. The file became my anchor over the next few days, not because it erased what had happened, but because it gave shape to something that had lived for too long as a vague unease. I organized the folder carefully, creating subfolders by category and date, naming each document in plain language so there could be no confusion later. Credit reports went in first, followed by screenshots of alerts, copies of emails I had almost ignored, and photos of envelopes I had once dismissed as junk. I printed everything and slid the pages into a thick binder, the sound of paper snapping into rings oddly satisfying, as if order itself were a form of protection. Each morning before work, I added to it, reviewing entries with a level of attention I had never given my own finances before. I noticed details I had missed in the first pass, the repetition of the same phone number across multiple accounts, the timing of loan openings that coincided with periods when my mother insisted on handling my paperwork, the way balances rose and were consolidated just as quietly. Writing everything down by hand helped slow my thoughts. Dates. Amounts, lenders, addresses. Patterns emerged that were impossible to unsee once they were laid out side by side. This was not a series of isolated incidents. It was a system. As I worked, memories surfaced uninvited moments that now carried new meaning. The afternoon my mother called to say she had taken care of something important for me and I did not need to worry. The time she sounded irritated when I asked for a statement and told me I was being dramatic. The way my father warned me not to rock the boat because family issues should stay inside the family. Those phrases echoed differently now stripped of their protective tone. At work, I moved through my tasks with a calm focus that surprised me. The fear that had once accompanied thoughts of confrontation was replaced by something steadier. Preparation. I was not planning a scene or a speech. I was preparing a record. In the evenings, I sat at my kitchen table with the binder open, highlighting entries, cross-referencing information, making notes in the margins. I resisted the urge to call my mother to demand explanations or apologies because I understood that emotional reactions would only muddy the facts. The file did not care about intent or excuses. It cared about accuracy. I read through official guidelines on financial abuse and identity theft, learning the language regulators used, the thresholds that triggered investigations, the steps victims were advised to take. Each paragraph reinforced the same principle. Documentation mattered. Consistency mattered. Silence protected the wrong people. As the file grew thicker, so did my sense of distance from the dinner that had started all of this. That night felt less like a personal attack and more like a catalyst, the final push that forced me to see what had been happening all along. I began to understand why my mother had needed that audience, why she had framed me as ungrateful and distant. If questions ever arose, she would have a ready-made explanation. I had left. I had chosen independence. I was difficult. The file dismantled that narrative piece by piece. It did not argue. It did not accuse. It simply existed. One evening, as I closed the binder and slid it onto the shelf, I felt a quiet shift inside me. I was no longer reacting to what my family had done. I was responding with clarity and intention. The file was not about revenge. It was about reclaiming my own name, my own history, and my own right to understand what had been done in my absence. Understanding that what I was dealing with had a name changed everything because once something is named, it becomes harder to excuse. Identity theft was not an abstract concept reserved for strangers and data breaches. It was a defined crime with clear elements, and as I read through official explanations late into the night, each one mapped uncomfortably well onto my own experience. Unauthorized accounts, use of personal identifying information, intent to obtain credit or financial benefit. I did not have to stretch the facts to make them fit. They fit on their own. That realization carried a heavy moral weight because it forced me to confront the difference between love that makes mistakes and actions that cause harm. Families could be complicated and flawed, but complexity did not erase accountability. As I compared my documentation to case examples, the same themes appeared again and again. Access was often abused by someone trusted. Victims were frequently told not to make a big deal out of it. Shame and loyalty were used to keep people quiet. Reading those words felt like someone had been watching my life from the outside and writing it down in neutral language. I paused often, letting the information settle, resisting the urge to minimize what I was seeing. Minimization had been my default response for years, a habit formed in childhood when acknowledging harm only made things worse. This time, I stayed with the discomfort. I reminded myself that understanding the truth did not require me to hate my family. It required me to be honest about what had happened. That distinction mattered. It allowed me to move forward without becoming trapped in anger or denial. I thought about the dinner again, about my mother framing my independence as betrayal, about her insistence that family problems should never involve outsiders. Seen through this lens, those statements took on a different meaning. They were not about unity. They were about insulation. If I accepted that what had been done in my name was a crime, then keeping it inside the family would only protect the person who committed it. The ethical line became clear. Loyalty that demands silence in the face of harm is not loyalty. It is complicity. That thought settled into me with a calm certainty that surprised me. I was not acting out of spite or embarrassment. I was responding to a violation that had real consequences for my future. Credit affected housing employment security. Allowing someone else to damage it without challenge would shape my life long after the emotions faded. The more I learned, the more I understood why I felt so steady instead of panicked. This situation was serious, but it was also structured. There were procedures. There were protections. There were people whose job it was to assess facts without regard for family dynamics. That realization removed my parents from the center of the story. This was no longer about whether they would admit wrongdoing or apologize. It was about restoring accuracy to records that affected me. I closed my laptop and sat quietly for a moment listening to the city outside my window, thinking about how often I had been told that family came before everything else. That phrase had always sounded virtuous, but it had been used to justify too much silence. I thought about younger versions of myself trusting and eager to please, and I felt a brief ache of sadness for how little protection that trust had offered. Then the feeling passed, replaced by resolve. Naming what had happened did not make me disloyal. It made me responsible to myself and to the life I was building. I understood then that whatever consequences followed would not be the result of me speaking up. They would be the result of actions that had already taken place, actions that could no longer hide behind the idea of family. Recognizing this as identity theft was not the end of the story. It was the point where the story stopped being personal and started being factual, and that shift gave me a clarity I had never experienced before. Filing the report felt less dramatic than I had imagined, and that in itself was revealing because it underscored how different reality was from the emotional narratives I had grown up with. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no pleading for understanding. There was simply a sequence of steps laid out clearly, asking for facts, dates, and documentation. I followed them carefully, my laptop open on the kitchen table, the binder beside me, each page within reach. The government site walked me through the process in plain language, explaining what constituted identity theft and what information would be needed to move forward. I entered my name, my address, my social security number, and then began listing the accounts that did not belong to me, double-checking every detail before submitting it. When the form asked how the unauthorized access might have occurred, I paused briefly, then described it accurately. Someone with long-term access to my personal information and financial documents had opened accounts without my knowledge or consent and directed correspondence away from me. I did not speculate about motives. I did not soften the language. I stayed with the facts. When I reached the end and clicked submit, there was no rush of emotion, only a steady sense of finality like closing a door that should have been closed years ago. The confirmation number appeared on the screen, and I wrote it down in my notebook, underlining it once. This was no longer a private concern. It existed within a system that did not care about family hierarchies or hurt feelings. After that, I moved on to the next steps, placing fraud alerts with each credit bureau one by one. Each call and online form followed a similar pattern: verification questions, short explanations, confirmation messages. The representatives I spoke with were polite and neutral, their tone focused on procedure, and that neutrality felt grounding. No one asked why this had happened or who I wanted to protect. They asked what needed to be corrected. Initiating the credit freeze was the last step, and when it was complete, I felt a subtle shift in my body as if something that had been exposed was finally secured. It was not relief exactly, but it was safety. I sat back in my chair and let the quiet fill the room, aware that this choice would likely change my relationship with my family forever. The weight of that realization pressed on me, but it did not make me hesitate. I had spent years prioritizing harmony over honesty, and the cost of that choice was now documented in black and white. Protecting myself did not feel radical anymore. It felt overdue. I thought about the warnings I had been given growing up that involving outsiders in family matters would only make things worse, that airing problems would bring shame. Those warnings were powerful because they kept accountability just out of reach. Filing the report cut through that logic completely. It reframed the situation in terms of responsibility rather than betrayal. If there were consequences, they would follow from the actions recorded in the file, not from my decision to speak. That distinction mattered more than anything else. I printed copies of the confirmation and added them to the binder, sliding the pages into plastic sleeves, each one a small layer of protection. As I organized the paperwork, my phone buzzed with a missed call from my mother. I did not answer it. I did not listen to the voicemail. Whatever she wanted to say would be shaped by the story she needed to tell herself. I was done negotiating reality. That night, as I prepared for bed, I noticed a calm settle over me that I had not felt before. It was the calm that comes from alignment, from knowing that your actions match your values even when the outcome is uncertain. Filing the report did not erase the pain of the dinner or the years of control that came before it, but it changed the balance of power. For the first time, I was not reacting to what my family had done. I was setting a boundary that existed outside their approval. Whatever came next would unfold according to process, not pressure, and that knowledge allowed me to sleep without rehearsing explanations in my head. Once the reports were filed and the freeze was in place, I understood that protecting myself quietly was not enough because silence was the environment where this kind of behavior thrived. I did not want a confrontation, and I did not want an audience fueled by gossip, but I did want pressure that did not depend on my voice being believed. That was when I decided to use the skill set I trusted most, the one I had built without my family help and without their approval. I opened my design software and started with a blank canvas, keeping the layout simple and clean. Nothing dramatic, nothing accusatory. I focused on clarity, icons instead of faces, numbers instead of names. Short statements that explained how financial abuse inside families often begins shared accounts opened for convenience, passwords kept by someone else. Mail redirected for safety. I wrote about warning signs without telling a story, patterns without identifying people. At the bottom, I added a single line that read, "This happened to me." No names, no dates, no locations. I wanted the information to stand on its own, recognizable to the people who needed it, and invisible to those who wanted to deny it. When I finished, I stared at the screen for a long time, checking myself for revenge or bitterness and finding neither. What I felt was resolve. I saved the file under a neutral name and created an anonymous account on a large online forum focused on personal finance and credit education. The post title was straightforward and restrained, explaining that a family member had abused access to financial information and that these were the steps I wished I had taken sooner. I attached the graphic and hit post before I could second-guess myself. Then I repeated the process on a professional networking site, framing the graphic as an educational resource about financial boundaries and identity protection, careful to keep the tone informational and calm. I did not mention family. I did not hint at motives. I let the content do the work. For a while, nothing happened. I answered work messages cooked. A simple dinner went through my usual routine, telling myself that even if the post disappeared into the noise, it had served its purpose for me. Then, the notifications started to shift. Comments appeared slowly at first, people asking questions, sharing similar experiences, thanking the anonymous poster for explaining things clearly. Messages arrived from strangers describing parents who handled their finances too closely, spouses who opened accounts without consent, relatives who crossed lines under the guise of help. Reading them was sobering and grounding at the same time. This was not an isolated incident or a personal failing. It was a pattern many people recognized once it was named. As the engagement grew, I felt a tightening in my chest that was not fear but anticipation, because pressure does not announce itself loudly at first. It builds quietly as information spreads and connections form. I did not respond emotionally. I answered questions factually, directing people to official resources and encouraging them to check their own records. By keeping my distance from the story, I allowed it to move without being attached to me. That distance was intentional. I was not trying to expose anyone publicly. I was creating a mirror that reflected behavior back to those who recognized themselves in it. Late that evening, as I refreshed the page one last time before bed, I noticed a private message waiting in my inbox from an account with a generic name. The message was brief and careful, thanking me for posting and saying the layout felt uncomfortably familiar. The sender asked if I would be willing to talk privately. I stared at the screen, my heart rate steady, because I knew then that the pressure had begun to reach beyond me. The message sat in my inbox for several minutes before I opened it, not because I was afraid of what it might say, but because I understood what it represented. Pressure only works when it spreads, and this was the first sign that the information I had shared had landed closer to home than I expected. The account name was neutral, nothing that hinted at identity, and the tone of the message was careful, almost cautious. The sender said the infographic matched something they had been experiencing for years, and that reading it made their stomach drop. They did not accuse anyone. They did not ask for advice. They simply asked if I would be willing to talk privately. I replied with a single sentence saying I could listen, but that I was not offering legal advice, only sharing my experience. A few minutes later, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. I answered, and the voice on the other end said my name softly, as if testing whether it was safe to say out loud. It was my Aunt Maria, my mother, older sister, 62 years old, an accountant who had always hovered at the edges of family gatherings present, but rarely centered in photos. We had never been close, but we had always shared an unspoken understanding that my mother dominated every room she entered. Maria told me she had seen the infographic first on the professional networking site, recognized the layout style, and then found the same image reposted in a discussion thread later that night. Something about it felt too precise to ignore. As she spoke, I stepped out onto my small balcony, the evening air cool against my skin, traffic humming below, grounding me in the present. Maria explained that a few years earlier, after a difficult period with her freelance work, my mother had offered to help her consolidate some debt. She said she trusted Isabella because she worked with numbers, because she always spoke with confidence, because family was supposed to help family. Papers were signed quickly, explanations were brief, and questions were brushed aside with reassurance. Recently, however, letters had begun arriving about a loan Maria insisted she had never taken. When she asked my mother about it, she was told it was a clerical error, nothing to worry about, the kind of thing that happened all the time. Hearing those words repeated back to me sent a chill through my chest because they were identical to phrases my mother had used with me. As Maria talked, I opened my laptop and created a new document, typing as she spoke, noting dates, lender names, approximate amounts, and the exact language my mother had used to dismiss concerns. At one point, Maria stopped mid-sentence and asked quietly if something similar had happened to me. I told her the truth, that I had found accounts in my name I did not open, that I had filed an identity theft report, and that the addresses tied to those accounts led back to my parents' house. There was a long pause on the line, followed by a slow exhale. Maria said she had suspected something was wrong for a long time, but had convinced herself she was overreacting, that questioning my mother felt disloyal. She admitted that the dinner had unsettled her, not just because of how I was treated, but because it felt rehearsed, like my mother was controlling the narrative in advance. We talked for over an hour, not emotionally but methodically comparing experiences, noticing overlaps that could no longer be explained away as coincidence. When we ended the call, Maria promised to scan and send me every piece of paperwork she could find, every letter she had ignored, because she was told to every document that carried my mother's handwriting or email address. After I hung up, I stood on the balcony for a long moment, listening to the city, feeling the scope of what was unfolding expand. This was no longer just my story. It was a pattern that reached across generations, hidden behind trust and authority. My phone buzzed again with a text from my mother asking why I had not been answering her calls. I did not respond. For the first time, her attempts to pull me back into conversation felt small compared to the clarity forming in front of me. The pressure I had set in motion was no longer abstract. It had found another witness, another set of documents, another person willing to stop minimizing what they already knew. Confronting my sister Sophia was not something I planned in advance, because planning implied I expected honesty, and I had learned not to build strategies around that assumption. She reached out 2 days after my conversation with our Aunt Maria, sending a short message that asked if we could meet for coffee near my office to talk like adults. The phrase irritated me more than it should have, because it suggested a balance that had never existed between us. Still, curiosity outweighed resentment, and I agreed. We met at a small cafe with plants hanging from the ceiling and a line of people waiting for overpriced drinks, the kind of place that felt neutral enough to have difficult conversations without attracting attention. Sophia arrived early and chose a corner table, her purse tucked close to her body, her posture tense. She looked tired, the careful polish she usually wore slipping at the edges. When she saw me, she smiled briefly, then looked down at her hands as if she were unsure which version of herself to present. We exchanged polite greetings and sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the cafe filling the gap between us. She started by saying she was sorry about how things had gone at the dinner, but her apology was framed around timing and tone, not intent. She said our mother had been under a lot of stress and that the situation had escalated faster than anyone expected. I listened without interrupting because I wanted to hear how far she would go to protect the story she was used to telling herself. When she finished, I slid a thin folder across the table toward her, the same one I had prepared for my own reference containing copies of my credit reports with unfamiliar accounts highlighted. I told her calmly that I had filed an identity theft report, that fraud alerts and a credit freeze were already in place, and that regulators and lenders would begin asking questions soon. The color drained from her face as she scanned the pages, her eyes catching on the repeated address listed under my name. She tried to laugh it off at first, saying our mother probably meant well, that she handled things for the family because she was good at it. I asked her when help started to include signing someone else's name on a loan. The question landed heavily between us. Sophia looked away, then back at the papers, her jaw tightening. I told her about my conversation with Maria about the documents she was sending about the pattern that was emerging. The word pattern seemed to unsettle her more than anything else because patterns implied intention. She admitted then quietly that there had been times our mother had handled financial matters for her as well. Moments when Sophia was overwhelmed, starting a new job or moving, when signing quickly felt easier than reading everything carefully. She said our mother had framed it as routine, as something families did to support each other. As she spoke, I took notes on my phone, not to intimidate her, but to keep myself grounded in facts. I asked her specific questions about dates, lenders, and amounts, and to her credit, she answered them honestly, her voice growing softer as she recognized names that matched the ones in my file. At one point, she stopped and rubbed her forehead, saying she had always trusted that our mother knew what she was doing, that questioning her felt impossible without becoming the villain. I told her I understood that feeling because it was the same one that had kept me quiet for years. The difference now was that silence had consequences. I explained that I was not trying to punish anyone or tear the family apart, but that I could not pretend this was normal or harmless. Sophia swallowed hard and asked what I planned to do next. I told her the truth, that I was cooperating fully with investigators and that I would not retract anything I had filed. I asked her for one thing only, that she send me any emails, texts, or documents she had involving our mother and money, especially anything tied to Maria or to accounts she did not fully understand at the time. She hesitated, then nodded, her eyes glossy but determined. She said she did not want our mother to go to prison, but she was tired of carrying a quiet dread she could not explain. When we stood to leave, the dynamic between us had shifted. We were not allies in the traditional sense, but we were no longer operating in separate realities. As I walked back toward my office, I felt a familiar pang of sadness for the relationship we might have had under different circumstances. It passed quickly, replaced by a steadier awareness. The truth did not need perfect messengers. It only needed people willing to stop protecting a story that could not survive scrutiny. My mother showed up at my office the following week without warning, and I knew something had shifted the moment the receptionist messaged me to say there was a woman asking for me who claimed to be my mother and looked very upset. I did not feel panic or guilt, only a steady irritation at the assumption that she still had access to me simply because she wanted it. When I walked into the lobby, she was standing near the seating area in her best blazer, hair carefully styled posture. Straight, the same version of herself she presented to bank managers and church friends. She smiled when she saw me, the familiar smile that had once made me question my own reactions, and said my name as if we were meeting for lunch. I glanced briefly at the security cameras in the corners of the ceiling and told her we could talk right there. Her smile tightened, but she sat anyway, crossing her legs and placing her purse neatly at her side. She started with an apology that felt rehearsed, saying things had gotten out of hand at the dinner and that emotions had been high. She spoke about how much pressure she was under, how hard it was to be a mother who cared too much, how painful it felt to be misunderstood by her own daughter. I let her talk without interrupting because I recognized the rhythm. She was laying groundwork, reframing events so that any resistance from me would appear unreasonable. Eventually, she shifted her voice, lowering slightly, and said she had seen something online, an infographic about financial abuse in families. She said people were talking and asked me directly what I had been saying about her. The question was revealing because it was not about whether I was okay or whether she had hurt me. It was about damage control. I told her calmly that I had shared educational information about financial boundaries and identity protection, and that I had not named anyone or described my personal situation publicly. I then told her that I had filed an identity theft report and placed a freeze on my credit. The effect was immediate. The color drained from her face, and her composure cracked just enough to show anger underneath. She leaned forward and asked if I had any idea what that could do to her career, to our family, to everything she had built. I told her I had a very clear idea of what had been done to my credit and to Maria, and that those actions existed regardless of whether I spoke about them. She tried to regain control, insisting she had only been helping, that she knew how to structure things properly, that family arrangements did not need outside interference. She said families did not call the law on each other, that airing issues publicly was betrayal. Her words echoed years of conditioning, but they no longer landed. I pulled a summary document from my bag and placed it on the table between us, a concise timeline of account dates and addresses that matched her house. I told her this was not everything, but it was enough. She stared at the page, her jaw tight, then looked back up at me and said, I did not understand how these things worked, that she knew people, that she could fix it quietly if I would just stop what I had started. That was the moment the conversation ended for me. I told her no. I said I was not deleting anything, not retracting any report, and not calling this a misunderstanding. I said whatever happened next would happen because of the records, not because of my feelings. Her expression hardened, and she warned me that if this blew up, it would hurt everyone, that I would be responsible for tearing the family apart. I told her she had that backwards, that signing other people's names and redirecting money was what caused damage, not the decision to document it. She stood abruptly, knocking her purse against the chair, and said I was making a mistake, that I would regret choosing strangers over blood. I watched her walk out of the building, heels clicking sharply against the floor, and felt no urge to chase her or explain myself. After she left, my manager stepped over quietly and asked if I needed anything. I told him there might be uncomfortable calls coming in the future, and he nodded, offering support without questions. That simple response felt more stabilizing than anything my family had offered me in years. As I returned to my desk, I understood that my mother had not come to reconcile. She had come to reassert control. By refusing it publicly and calmly, I had changed the terms of engagement. From that point on, whatever unfolded would move through systems that did not recognize her authority, and that shift mattered more than any argument we could have had. The systems listened in a way my family never had, not because they cared about my feelings, but because they cared about records, and that difference made all the difference. Within days of filing the reports, emails began to arrive from lenders acknowledging receipt of my dispute and requesting verification. The language was formal and precise, asking for copies of documents, signatures, and timelines, and I provided everything without hesitation. Each response I sent felt like adding another brick to a wall that had not existed before, a barrier built on facts instead of fear. A representative from one of the banks called to walk through the process, her tone neutral, her questions focused on consent and authorization. When I answered no to each one, she paused briefly, then thanked me and explained what would happen next. Accounts would be reviewed, activity would be traced, access logs would be examined, the matter would be referred to compliance. There was no judgment in her voice, no suggestion that family dynamics excused what had occurred. That neutrality was unexpectedly comforting. Around the same time, I received confirmation that my identity theft report had been forwarded to the appropriate agencies and that follow-up contact might occur. The wording was calm and procedural, outlining my rights and the steps involved. I read it twice, absorbing the reality that this was now larger than me and my parents. It existed within institutions designed to assess harm without regard for personal narratives. Maria began sending scanned documents as promised emails where my mother had reassured her that letters from lenders were mistakes. Loan statements Maria swore she had never seen signatures that did not match her handwriting. I added each file to the binder, labeling them carefully, noting overlaps with my own records. The pattern sharpened into something undeniable. Funds moved when my parents needed them. Consolidations occurred after conversations where concern was expressed and trust was leveraged. The same addresses and contact information appeared again and again. When Sophia forwarded screenshots of messages where our mother instructed her where to sign and told her not to worry about reading everything, the scope widened further. I sent copies of those messages to my attorney, who had agreed to review the material and advise me on next steps. He did not sound surprised. He said cases like this often relied on silence and delay, and once documentation existed, they tended to unravel quickly. A few weeks later, I received a call from a compliance officer at my mother's workplace, a credit union she had worked at for decades. The officer explained that they were conducting an internal review into several loan files connected to employees and their relatives, and that my complaint was part of a broader inquiry. She asked if I would be willing to answer questions and provide documentation. I agreed without hesitation. The interview was methodical and thorough, focusing on dates, access, and authorization. When it ended, the officer thanked me and said they would be in touch. I hung up and sat quietly for a moment, aware that the consequences I had been warned about were no longer hypothetical, they were in motion. The difference was that I was no longer carrying them alone. Investigators reached out next, asking for permission to use my documentation as part of their review. The conversations were calm and structured, the questions specific. Each time I answered, I felt a small shift inside me, a sense of alignment that came from telling the truth plainly. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public scenes. The process moved slowly, deliberately, like a machine designed to ignore intimidation and focus on evidence. My parents' attempts to contact me increased for a while, calls and messages framed as concern and then as accusation, but I did not engage. I forwarded anything relevant to my attorney and saved the rest. Silence this time was not submission. It was strategy. As weeks turned into months, updates arrived in pieces. Accounts were flagged. Disputes were resolved in my favor. My credit reports began to change, fraudulent entries, removed one by one, replaced with notes indicating identity theft. Each correction felt tangible, measurable proof that the system was working as intended. The dinner that had begun all of this faded into the background, less a source of pain than a reference point. What mattered now was the steady accumulation of outcomes. Systems listened because systems were built to respond to documentation, not dominance. And for the first time, the authority that had shaped my life for so long no longer had the final word. The consequences did not arrive all at once, and that slowness made them feel more real, like watching a structure weaken under its own weight instead of collapse in a single dramatic moment. The first clear sign came in the form of an envelope forwarded to me by my attorney, a formal letter from my mother credit union informing her that she had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of an internal investigation. The language was careful and restrained, avoiding conclusions while outlining violations of policy related to conflicts of interest and unauthorized access. I read it twice, not with satisfaction, but with a sober recognition that this was the inevitable result of actions that had gone unchecked for years. Maria called me the same evening, her voice shaking slightly as she described sitting in a conference room with compliance officers and a lawyer answering questions about documents she had trusted without reading. She said they showed her loan files with signatures that did not look like hers and asked if she had ever given permission for anyone to sign on her behalf. She said no clearly and firmly, and that saying it out loud felt like stepping into her own life again. My grandmother, who had always deferred to my mother when it came to money, was interviewed next at her assisted living center, her lawyer present. From what I was told later, she cried when she saw the numbers laid out plainly. Proceeds from the sale of her home that she never received, fees she did not understand, decisions she had never approved. The family narrative of helpful management did not survive contact with documented reality. My father tried one last time to intervene, calling me late one evening with a voice heavy with frustration and fear. He said outsiders were tearing the family apart, that investigators did not understand how families helped each other behind closed doors. I told him quietly that forging signatures and rerouting funds were not misunderstandings and that asking me to retract the truth would not change the records. He hung up without saying goodbye. On the civil side, my aunt and grandmother lawyers filed suit seeking restitution, naming both of my parents as beneficiaries of funds obtained through misrepresentation. My name appeared in the filings as a victim of identity theft, a designation that felt strange and grounding at the same time. My attorney asked if I wanted to attend the first hearing. I declined. I did not need to watch my mother explain away documents that spoke for themselves. Instead, I signed an affidavit, swore to it before a notary, and let my words live on the page where they could not be interrupted or reframed. Settlement discussions began sooner than I expected. Faced with the volume of documentation and the possibility of criminal referral, my parents agreed to unwind the fraudulent accounts, repay funds to Maria and my grandmother, and cover additional damages. They did not do it out of remorse. They did it because their attorney explained that continuing would expose them to even greater scrutiny. Assets were liquidated quietly to cover the terms. The house with the wall of photographs was sold. The upgraded truck my father had been proud of was gone. Pieces of the life they had presented so carefully were dismantled not by me, but by arithmetic. Throughout it all, my credit reports continued to improve, each correction a small restoration of something that had been taken without my knowledge. The freeze remained in place this time by my choice, a boundary I controlled. Friends at work noticed I seemed lighter, more focused, and I realized they were responding to something simple. I was no longer carrying a secret that did not belong to me. When my mother was formally terminated and her license suspended pending review, the news reached me indirectly through Maria and then through a cousin. I felt no triumph. I felt a quiet finality. The authority she had wielded for decades had ended not because I challenged it emotionally, but because systems that required accountability had finally been engaged. The dinner that had once felt like a public erasure now seemed small compared to what followed. It had been the spark, not the fire. What burned away was not my place in the family, but the illusion that silence equaled loyalty. As the months passed, the dust settled into a new configuration. My parents moved into a smaller rental on the edge of town. My father took on a partner in his business and answered to spreadsheets instead of ego. Conversations about me shifted from accusation to avoidance. And in that quiet, I built something steadier, not a revenge story. A life where my name belonged to me. My records reflected reality, and my future was no longer collateral for someone else's need to feel powerful. After the legal dust settled, what surprised me most was not how much had changed for my parents, but how quietly my own life continued. There was no victory lap, no moment where everything suddenly felt resolved. I still woke up early, made coffee in the same chipped mug, and checked my calendar before work. The difference was internal and unmistakable. I no longer braced myself when my phone buzzed, no longer felt a reflexive guilt when I thought about saying no. The silence from my parents stretched on, punctuated occasionally by indirect messages passed through relatives who wanted reassurance that I was not angry, as if anger were the problem that needed managing. I let those messages pass without response. My boundary did not require explanation. Maria and I spoke regularly now, not just about documents and follow-ups, but about ordinary things, her garden, my projects, the quiet relief she felt knowing her finances were finally hers again. She told me once that she slept better than she had in years, and I understood exactly what she meant. Sophia and I maintained a cautious connection, exchanging updates without pretending we were closer than we were. She sent me confirmation when her own accounts were reviewed and corrected, and I sensed in her messages the slow rebuilding of trust with herself, even if trust in our parents would never fully return. At work, the ripple effects were subtle but meaningful. My manager followed through on his offer of support, looping in company counsel to ensure my workplace remained insulated from harassment or interference. That simple act of belief reinforced something I had learned the hard way. Safety comes from systems that respect boundaries, not from people who demand access. As my credit stabilized and the last fraudulent entries were removed, I kept the freeze in place, a deliberate reminder that openness should always be chosen, never assumed. On weekends, I began taking on small design projects focused on translating complex information into clear language, the same skill that had helped me reclaim my own narrative. Messages arrived from strangers who had seen the infographic or the site I built afterward, thanking me for putting words to something they could not quite name. I answered when I could, careful not to center myself, pointing them instead toward resources and steps they could take on their own. It felt right to turn something that had been used to control me into something that offered clarity to others. The family gatherings I once attended out of obligation faded from my calendar, replaced by smaller, quieter moments with people who did not require performance to offer belonging. There were days when grief surfaced unexpectedly, not for what I had lost, but for what I had never truly had. I let that grief exist without rushing to fix it. Healing, I learned, was not about replacing one illusion with another. It was about accepting reality and building from there. Occasionally, I would think back to the dinner, to the moment my image was taken off the wall in front of everyone, and I would feel a strange gratitude for its bluntness. Without that public erasure, I might have continued to compromise myself to preserve a version of family that only existed on display. The cost of that compromise would have followed me quietly for decades. Instead, I had stepped out of the frame and into my own life. My story did not end with reconciliation or forgiveness neatly wrapped in a bow. It ended with clarity, with documents that matched the truth, with relationships that respected consent, and with a future that no longer required me to disappear to keep others comfortable. The longer I lived inside this quieter version of my life, the more I understood how deeply normalized dysfunction had been in my family, especially the way power moved along gendered lines without ever being named. Growing up, the expectations were clear, even when they were never stated outright. My brother Mateo was encouraged to take risks, to speak loudly, to make mistakes and be forgiven for them because he was learning. Sophia and I were taught to be careful, to be agreeable, to anticipate needs before they were voiced. When my brother raised his voice, it was dismissed as passion. When I did the same, it was labeled disrespect. That imbalance had been reinforced over years of dinners and holidays, jokes disguised as advice, warnings framed as love. My mother had enforced those rules with precision, rewarding compliance and punishing resistance, especially from her daughters. Financial control had been the sharpest tool in that system because it allowed her to position herself as indispensable while keeping us dependent. Seeing it clearly now, I could trace how that dynamic made what happened almost inevitable. I had been trained to defer. She had been trained to take. When the investigation exposed her actions, some relatives tried to reframe the story in familiar ways, saying she had only done what she thought was best, that she was protecting the family, that women in her position had to be strong. Those explanations rang hollow because strength that requires secrecy and coercion is not strength. It is dominance dressed up as duty. I thought often about how easily the narrative could have turned against me if I had reacted emotionally instead of methodically. An angry daughter is easy to dismiss. A documented pattern is not. That realization stayed with me as I watched extended family recalibrate their behavior, some reaching out cautiously, others retreating into silence. A few admitted privately that they had suspected something was wrong for years, but had been afraid to say anything, afraid of becoming the next problem child. I did not judge them. Fear thrives in systems where authority goes unchallenged. What mattered was that the system itself had been disrupted. Mateo never contacted me directly, and I noticed how his absence underscored everything. He had not been asked to mediate, to apologize, or to explain. His distance was treated as neutrality, another privilege quietly granted. Recognizing that did not make me bitter. It made me precise. I adjusted my expectations accordingly. I stopped hoping for fairness from people who benefited from imbalance. Instead, I invested my energy where accountability existed. Over time, my family became less a central force in my identity and more a background context I understood without needing to revisit constantly. I built routines that felt grounding: morning walks, scheduled check-ins with myself about finances and boundaries, habits that reinforced autonomy rather than eroded it. The work I did on the side grew slowly, not into something flashy, but into something sustainable. Each project reminded me that clarity could be a form of care, that explaining systems did not require control. When people asked how I found the strength to take things so far, I did not talk about courage. I talked about exhaustion, about what happens when minimizing harm costs more than addressing it. I did not set out to dismantle my family structure. I set out to protect myself. The rest followed because systems built on silence cannot survive sustained attention. Understanding that allowed me to release the last traces of guilt that had lingered quietly at the edges of my progress. I was not disloyal. I was honest. And honesty, once practiced consistently, has a way of reshaping everything around it, whether people are ready for it or not. The final shift did not come from another letter call or update, but from a quiet moment that felt almost ordinary. I was sitting at my kitchen table one evening, reviewing my monthly budget, a habit I had developed deliberately, when it struck me that there was no longer anything hidden. Every account was mine. Every number made sense. There were no envelopes routed elsewhere, no passwords I did not control, no explanations I had to accept on faith. That realization landed with more force than any courtroom outcome, because it marked the end of a cycle that had shaped my adult life without my consent. I thought about how many years I had been told that independence was risky, that handling things myself would lead to mistakes that I needed oversight to stay safe. The truth was the opposite. Transparency had brought safety. Control had brought harm. In the months after the settlements, I began sharing my experience more deliberately, not as a confession, but as a case study. I spoke with a small community group focused on financial literacy for women, explaining how easily boundaries could blur inside families and how important it was to check your own records regularly. I kept my story factual and restrained, focusing on steps rather than drama. The response was immediate and humbling. Women older than me thanked me quietly, saying they wished someone had told them these things earlier. Younger women asked practical questions, hungry for information that did not talk down to them. Each conversation reinforced the same truth. Knowledge changes power dynamics, especially in environments where silence has been normalized. I never named my parents publicly. I did not need to. The impact of what had happened was no longer measured by exposure, but by correction. When holidays came around, I spent them differently with friends with Maria, sometimes alone, without the pressure to perform closeness or forgiveness on a schedule that suited someone else. I learned to tolerate the discomfort of not being understood by everyone because understanding from the wrong people had always come with conditions. There were moments of doubt late at night when I wondered if things could have ended differently if there had been a version of events where accountability and reconciliation coexisted neatly. Those thoughts passed when I returned to the facts. Change had only occurred once documentation replaced denial. That was not something I could have achieved through gentler means. The story my family told about itself had depended on my silence. My refusal to provide it was not cruelty. It was truth. As I prepared for the next phase of my life, planning a move to a new apartment, considering long-term goals without factoring in someone else's approval, I felt a steadiness that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with alignment. My actions matched my values. My records matched reality. My relationships, though fewer, were grounded in consent rather than obligation. The dinner that once felt like an ending had revealed itself as a beginning, not because it hurt, but because it clarified. Being treated like I did not belong forced me to ask a harder question. Not where do I fit, but what am I willing to accept? The answer reshaped my life in ways I am still discovering quietly, intentionally, and without apology. The story did not close with applause or forgiveness or a family photo restored to the wall, and that is exactly why it feels honest. Life moved forward in small, practical ways. I signed a lease on a new apartment in a different neighborhood, one chosen entirely by me, with paperwork I read line by line and passwords I never shared. I set reminders to pull my credit reports regularly, not out of fear, but out of respect for myself. The binder that once held evidence now lived on a shelf, no longer growing, no longer needed daily, but still there as proof that truth survives when it is written down. My parents remained distant, their silence heavy but no longer powerful. I stopped waiting for them to understand because understanding was never required for me to live honestly. What mattered was that I understood. I learned that family can be a fact without being a destination, that shared blood does not obligate shared access, and that love which demands your disappearance is not love worth preserving. Sometimes people asked if I regretted how far things went. I told them no, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Regret belongs to choices made without clarity. I acted with it. The dinner that was meant to shrink me ended up exposing everything that could no longer stay hidden. That was not my doing alone. It was the natural consequence of truth meeting daylight. I no longer measure success by approval or proximity. I measure it by peace, by autonomy, by the quiet confidence that comes from knowing my life is not being managed behind my back. If there is one thing I carry forward, it is this. You do not owe silence to people who misuse your trust. You do not owe access to people who confuse control with care. And sometimes, the moment you are treated like you do not belong is the moment you finally stop trying to fit and start building something that is actually yours.